Hello everybody, and sorry I couldn't be in the building on Sunday morning, and apologies for the poor audio in the talk I recorded. Clearly things weren't going well, so I thought I'd re-record it and make it available so at least people can catch up in the week. As you listen to the passage being read, if you hadn't read it, it's Hebrews 2, 5 to 18. It made me think about some of the big questions that we think about in life. Questions like, what is the purpose and meaning of life? How do we solve the problems the world is facing? And then maybe that question that comes to us in the small hours of the night when we're quiet and just on our own. Do I have any significance at all? And I felt that sometimes when I've been travelling and been in large cities where there are millions of people and I'm just one person, and what significance do I have? And sometimes questions like that can be really challenging. Sometimes they can be really helpful. Sometimes they can make us feel rather down. And the passage that we read, this passage in Hebrews 2, starts by thinking about the position of humanity in God's creation. So it's a big picture response to that sort of big question. And it draws from passages like Psalm 144 and Psalm 8, and allows the author to outline a number of things. In Psalm 144, verse 3 and 4, the psalmist is amazed that God cares for humanity in the way that he does. He says, Lord, what are human beings that you care for them? Mere mortals that you think of them. They're like a breath. Their days are like a fleeting shadow. So much difference between God and us. We are mortal. Our lives are finite as opposed to God, who is immortal, who has always existed and always will. In the cosmic calendar where stars and planets are formed over billions of years, the lives that we live are like a single breath, a shadow that is there and then gone as the light that creates it flicks out. It's like a single tick of a clock. But the psalmist has just been able to recognise that God loves him, God protects him, God gives him refuge. We get this in verse 2. And the psalmist continues to be amazed by it. Amazed that such an immense and awesome God should be interested in him. And then in Psalm 8, the psalmist speaks about the position that God has placed humanity in. Verse 5 and 6 has these amazing words. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honour. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. It's not just that God is interested in humanity. Rather, he's given them a position just under the angels, those incredibly powerful beings we were thinking about last week. Let's dwell on that for a moment and think about what that says about us. I don't know how you're feeling about yourself right at this moment, whether you feel good about yourself or are really struggling with identity, struggling with purpose, struggling with health and not being good enough and struggling with what others think of you. You are one of those people whom God has placed in a position of authority just under the angels. You are one of those people whom God has crowned with glory and honour. You matter. You are important. Not because of what I say, but because of the place that God has placed you in. And maybe you're listening to this. You really need to hear this, to accept it, to allow the reality of it to replace the ideas that we might have about ourselves, or to respond to our society making us feeling inadequate. We are important. And then God has called humanity to partner with him to be stewards over the creation that he has made, to rule over it. He doesn't just give us a status, he gives us a role and responsibilities, a purpose in life. And the author of Hebrews takes these words as a way of speaking about the humanity of Jesus. He recognises that we, as humanity, struggle to carry out the commission that God gave us to care for his planet. But he encourages us not to focus on that, but to focus on Jesus. In verse 9 he says this, "We see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honour, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." Just as humanity as a whole is positioned slightly below the angels, so Jesus, for a little while, was made lower than them. And we are told a number of things about this Jesus. He suffered death. Here we see another difference between Jesus and the angels. As angels don't die, Jesus speaks about this in Luke 20:36. But we are all too aware that we die, and here we see Jesus in his humanity going through that same experience. But for Jesus, it was a death that involved suffering and shame and real pain, as he was mocked, beaten, and nailed to a cross. And he did it so that he could taste death for everyone. And the idea here is not like when we just taste something and leave it at that, maybe think, I don't want that, I don't like that. Jesus fully went into and experienced death. But his death was special. It was for everyone. And this is explained in much more detail a bit later in this passage. And we're going to see this a number of times in this book, where the author introduces an idea, he expands on it a bit, and then later on he brings it into full bloom and really develops his idea to help us understand what he's saying. And this also tells us that Jesus, having suffered and experienced death and being restored to life, that God has given him the place of authority and glory and honour, which, as we saw last week, resulted in angels being commanded to worship him. And here we are reminded that the suffering and the sacrifice that Jesus went through was no accident, but something that he was prepared to do willingly for us, for each human being who has ever lived or will live, for you, for me. This is part of what the humanity of Jesus made possible. The writer goes on to verse 10, "In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered." From that place of glory, Jesus draws people to join him, something that all who believe in him can look forward to with total confidence and anticipation. And even as we grieve those who have gone before us, who are no longer with us, we can rejoice that they are now included in the people whom Jesus has brought to that place of glory and honour as they enter into the salvation he made possible. And as verse 11 talks about, he's welcomed them as brothers and sisters. What an amazing thing to know that has been made possible through the humanity of Jesus. It's also important to think briefly about the idea of Jesus being made perfect, as it says in that verse, because one way of reading it suggests that there was a time when Jesus was not perfect. But that isn't the point here. We know from elsewhere in the New Testament that Jesus was the only human being who has ever lived without sinning. We get this a bit later in this letter in chapter 4, verse 15. We also get it in a number of other places in the New Testament. So that's not what this is talking about. Rather, this being made perfect, which again is an idea that keeps on appearing in this letter, is talking more about how the things Jesus experienced, including his suffering and death, was preparing him for a role he was going to take on, a role that is explained at the end of this chapter, and then again in much more detail later on. So we'll see a bit of that now. I'm going to expand that in the weeks ahead. So let's have a look at what Jesus did, why he did it, and what it enables him to do. And as we think about that, we'll think about the wonderful and life-changing implications for us. Verse 14 and 15 says this: "Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death." So in verse 14, Jesus is speaking about the children God has given him, people who know God as Father, people like us, whom Jesus has drawn into relationship with God. And here we are reminded of the wonderful reality that to break the power of death that hangs over each one of us, the eternal Son of God chose to become one of us, to be born into this world, to live as a human being. But even though he became one of us, there were so many things about him that were unique. He was what humanity was always intended to be, but had always failed to manage to live up to. If we were to work through the biblical story, it's a great thing to do. We would see God creating humanity as the pinnacle of his creation and calling them to be partners in caring for that creation. And then we see time and again people called out to live as God intended, but failing and falling down. We would see God choosing people like Abraham. We would see God choosing a nation called Israel to live in his blessing and to be a blessing to the whole world, to show the rest of humanity what it was like to live in this relationship with God. But none of them were able to live out that calling until Jesus, whose commitment eventually led him to confront the problem and reality of death, to go through death, to defeat it, and to free us from it. Not that we will no longer die, that is ahead for each one of us, unless Jesus returns before then, but it no longer needs to be something we fear, but something that we can treat as a gateway, a door into a renewed, a restored experience with Jesus. Verse 16 has this sort of maybe strange insert, for surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. And here it's picking up on the idea that angels don't need to be set free from the power of death. We're told that they don't die. Rather, it is something that affects Abraham's descendants. And I was left wondering why the author refers specifically to Abraham's descendants, as opposed to just talking about people in general. And I think it's because this term speaks about those who are in a relationship with God, people who are experiencing the blessings that God promised to Abraham. And this is very much the audience to whom the author is writing. And the author wants to remind them that it was such people that Jesus came to help. They are included. They are the recipients of what Jesus has done. And as we think that they were thinking about turning away from Jesus, here the author is reminding them, saying, actually, through Jesus, you're included in what God is doing. Let's not turn away from that to something else. And this doesn't mean that the death and resurrection of Jesus isn't something that only some people can benefit from. It's for everyone. But here in this letter, the author seems to want to remind his hearers that to fully experience the blessings God has for them, they need to accept and rely on what Jesus has done for them. And exactly the same is true for us today. Verse 17 goes on to say this: "For this reason, he, that is Jesus, had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people." So to help people to deal with the problem of fear of death, God's Son needed to become fully and completely human. It was only then that he could take on the role of our high priest. And we'll be thinking about the role of the high priest a lot more over the next few weeks. But for now, we see that this high priest, he's somebody who ministers to God and is the one who makes atonement for the sins of the people whom he serves. Chapter 5, verse 1 tells us that a high priest is selected from among the people he serves. He is one of them. And so for Jesus to become our high priest, he first needed to be one of us. Someone we could look at and associate ourselves with. Someone in whom we recognise so much of what is involved in being human. Someone who lived and breathed and walked and talked and developed deep relationships. Someone who became tired and hungry. Someone who experienced emotions of grief and anger and joy. Someone who faced the tragic reality of death in others and in himself. It was only someone like this who could become our merciful and faithful high priest. And in this role, he made atonement for our sins. Now, atonement is a technical term. It's worth exploring it a bit so we understand what it means. It speaks about getting rid of anything that would get between us and God, that would prevent us having a relationship with him. It takes us back to the Old Testament system of sacrifices, where there was one special day in the year set aside as the Day of Atonement. You can read about it in Leviticus 16. And on this day, the high priest was required to sacrifice animals to get rid of anything that had crept into the lives of God's people and to restore that community into full relationship with God. This reminds us that to get rid of the fear of death, we needed God's Son to become one of us and to make atonement for us. And to do that, he offered a sacrifice. But instead of the animal sacrifices that high priests made year after year, he offered himself as a perfect sacrifice just once when he died on the cross. And again, we'll look at all of this in more detail as we get further into this amazing book. But for now, let's focus on what this verse tells us and what's behind it all. It tells us that God loved us enough, God loved you enough to send his Son into the world. That his Son loved us enough, loved you enough to become one of us, the person named Jesus. And that Jesus loved us enough, loved you enough to die for us, to die for you, so that we could be set free from the fear of death. So that you could be drawn back into a loving relationship with God. These are some of the reasons why Jesus is the greatest human being to have ever lived, and the one who did all those things for you and for me. And the question for each of us is, how are we going to respond to him and all he has done for us? The passage ends with verse 18 saying, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. And not only did Jesus make atonement for our sins, but he's able to help us in the realities and challenges of life, the life that we live out every day. The main account of Jesus being tempted is found in the opening verses of Matthew chapter 4, also in Luke 4, where we find that he was alone in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights without eating anything. And that at the end of that time, the devil appears to him and tempts him to try and get him to turn away from the path that God had for him. And these were real temptations, brought at a time when Jesus was really hungry, and so his physical defences would have been down a bit. But he was able to respond to and reject all the temptations that the devil could bring against him. And he went away, waiting for another opportunity. Jesus was tempted and tested on many other occasions as well. People trying to prevent him continuing in his ministry, with a close friend challenging him about the path he was taking. And all this led to his suffering and death on the cross. He has gone through all of this. He has experienced temptations from outside. He has been tested in many ways. He has suffered more than any of us ever could. And because of this, he's able to come alongside those who are being tempted to turn away from God, tested under all sorts of pressures, suffering in deep and challenging ways, and is able to offer help and comfort and support. He understands, he knows, he cares. And if, whenever you're listening to this, you're feeling under pressure, maybe temptations you just don't know how to resist or to deal with, maybe burdens that you are struggling to carry, maybe sufferings that are just grinding you down and down, Jesus cares. Jesus is able to help. He demonstrated that by becoming one of us and experiencing so much of what it's like to be human. And we, as a community of God's people, have the privilege of acting as signposts and pointers to Jesus for those in our community who are going through these challenging experiences, to listen, to share, to encourage, to pray. So let's be aware of those around us who are finding life hard, and seek to come alongside them and journey with them, and find ways of not only doing that, but pointing them to the Jesus who wants to journey with them as well. So if you, as you listen to this, are feeling in need of support or encouragement for whatever reason, please speak with somebody you know is part of our church family, someone you know who you trust, who knows Jesus. Maybe that we can share, that we can pray, that we can encourage. And together, we can ask Jesus to come and provide the help and support that is only available in him. Jesus, the greatest human being who ever lived, the one who became one of us, so that he could deal with the problems that we all experience and enable us to be drawn back into a relationship with God, and to be there to encourage and to help and share in all the things we face in life. I just pray that will be the experience of each one of us as we reflect on the pioneer of our faith, the one who's gone before us, and the one who seeks to lead us on into all the great things he has for us. May God bless each and every one of us in him.